following presentation, we will be discussing meat legislation in history. So grab something to write with and something to write on, and take a few notes as we look at Part 1 of meat legislation and history. The meat industry. The meat industry has had a long history in the United States. This history began when longhorn cattle were brought to the Americas by the Spaniards in the 1490s. The meat industry is also constantly increasing its knowledge related to food safety and is regulated on a federal level by legislative action. Legislation. Legislation implemented the federal and state regulation of ante-mortem, that means before the animal dies, and post-mortem, which that means after the animal dies, inspection of meat animals. It also established approved harvesting procedures of animals, with some exceptions allowed for religious slaughter. Legislation also sets critical levels for bacteria and illness. Important meat legislation includes the following acts: the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921, Humane Slaughter Act of 1958, Wholesome Meat Act of 1967, and the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act of 1978. The Meat Inspection Act. This act was enacted on June the 30th, 1906 to prevent the adulteration and misbranding of meat products. The Meat Inspection Act was prompted by the publishing of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. In this book, Sinclair exposed the conditions of immigrants and working in the United States. He also brought attention to the conditions in meat processing plants. This act has four main impacts on the meat industry: ante-mortem inspection of all livestock before slaughter, post-mortem inspection of every carcass, sanitary conditions in all meat processing facilities. Authorize the United States Department of Agriculture to monitor and inspect all harvesting and processing operations. The next act is the Pure Food and Drug Act. It was also enacted in 1906, the same day as the Meat Inspection Act. This act provided for federal inspection of all meat products, prohibits the sale, manufacture, and transportation of adulterated food products. It also paved the way for the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. The Packers and Stockyards Act. This was enacted on June 15, 1921. It gave the Secretary of Agriculture and the USDA authorization to regulate livestock marketing and meat packaging. This monitored the scales and the brands of meat. This act has been amended 5 times. Once in 1958, 1976, 1987, 2000, in 2002. The Humane Slaughter Act. This act was passed in 1958. It requires for animals whose meat would be sold, was required for animals' meat who would be sold to federal agencies. It applied to only cattle, horses, mules, sheep, and swine. This act has been amended, and the law, now enforced by the Food Safety Inspection Service, was passed in 1978. The Wholesome Meat Act. This act was an amendment to the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and was passed in 1967. It requires state inspection of processing facilities to equal or exceed federal inspection standards. The Wholesome Meat Act requires a federal USDA or state inspection mark. This mark can be found on the can, package, and/or primal cuts of meat. It assures meat is from healthy animals harvested and processed under sanitary conditions. The federal or state inspection mark indicates wholesomeness, not quality. Let's review some of the concepts of meat legislation in history, Part 1. Turn your sheet of paper over and number from 1 to 8 and consider the following questions. Number 1. What breed of cattle were first brought to the Americas by the Spaniards? Number 2. What do the terms antemortem and postmortem mean in regards to the slaughter of animals? Number 3. The Meat Inspection Act was passed after the influence of what book being published? Number 4. True or false? The Meat Inspection Act only includes impacts meat sanitation. The Meat Inspection Act only impacts meat sanitation. Number 5. Which act paved the way for the creation of the Food and Drug Administration? Number 6. What is the main purpose of the Packers and Stockyards Act? Number 7. What species of livestock are covered by the Humane Slaughter Act? Number 8. True or false? The state or federal inspection mark indicates meat quality. This has been Part 1 of meat legislation in history. I hope you have a better understanding of how meat legislation has impacted the industry that provides meat for consumers to use in the United States of America. Thank you.